Okay, so this is a continuation of sorts in our army-related topic selection. We're going to start segueing away from actual army dinim to more weapon dinim, like the halachas of gun ownership and carrying a gun on Shabbos and women carrying guns and bringing a gun into shul. I think there's a lot of gun ownership shilas that could be discussed. There's a lot of gun ownership today that there wasn't always before. Today it's much more common to own a gun. So, could you bring your gun to Seder? These are all very wichtig shilas. What do you say? Yeah. It can be dangerous. What do you say?
They have a lot of weapons.
Huh?
In Europe.
So anyhow, let's just start like this. We've been talking about army shilas. Now I just want to reset the table with the army shilas as follows. We kept mentioning that back in the day, throughout Jewish history, Jewish soldiers was very, very uncommon. It mostly had to do with prejudice. The Daesh authorities, be they Catholic or Muslims, they didn't want Jewish infidels or deicidists in their army, and they didn't allow Jews. Now there was an interesting thing. There was a tkufa when Jews were forced to provide goods and materials to the army. The governments, who knew that they weren't getting enough out of their Jews because they weren't putting them in the army, would require them to provide goods and services to the army. And there's a whole slew of shilas in the early Paiskim, like Rishonim and Gedolei Achronim, about Jews who are interacting with the army through that way, through their providing goods and services and Shabbos shilas and whatever. But we're going to leave that aside. Now, the Ikar shilas that I want to focus on is halacha shilas that come up when soldiers are actually in the army. So as follows. During, let's say, the Crusader time, 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago, 700 years ago, an army was like this. There would be people, usually violent people, who made fighting their forte. They made that the profession. In Europe, they were called knights. In other countries, they were called other things. And they were basically guns for hire. They were mercenaries, meaning you wanted to put together an army, so you had to raise money. If you had enough cash, you could buy a horde of knights, and they would go do your battles. Now, at some point, I think it was King Louis XIV of France who realized that that's expensive, and he could be squeezing it out of his citizens, and he implemented the first draft, meaning the idea of taking a certain percentage of your population and putting them to work in the army, making them fight for you, fight for the country. Now, all the other kings of Europe, the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, etc., they all liked this idea too. They caught on to it, the British, and they all started drafting soldiers from their population. They would, billet these soldiers all over the country, different places, and then they would, have a standing army. The idea of a standing army, with soldiers from the population, was a relatively new idea. Now, once that happened, originally, soldiers were drafted from all the classes of society in different amounts, meaning if you had a protector, if you were a nobleman or whatever, you had less likely that you were going to go to the army. The peasants were the ones who were drafted. Still like today, the army is, often stocked with that type of people. And Jews were not included in it. Now, what's interesting is even during this time of knights, before army from draft was happening, there's a lot of shilas about Jews owning weapons. Now, it seems that in Germany, Befrat, where the shilas are, a lot of Jews owned weapons because it was dangerous. To travel was dangerous. Anybody who was on the road for business was dangerous. You could be mugged, but there was all sorts of roving gangs of, brigands and whatever out there in the forest. Like we say, kol hadrachim b'cheska sakana. You couldn't just be out and about. So anyone who was in business had a gun. The guns didn't exist, but had a sword or a bow and arrow or some sort of primitive form of a weapon to be able to defend themselves. Additionally, people lived in Stadtlach, whatever, and there could be a time when Goyim would attack the city and there'd be need. Now, the weapons of the day were chainmail. You know what chainmail is? A mesh, armor mesh. It's harder to penetrate. What do you say? Chainmail? Oh, really? Yeah, so it's much harder to penetrate than just solid because the knife gets tangled in the mesh. So chainmail was a big thing. Helmets, obviously shields, made out of steel or whatever. Now, where there are these shilas is there's many cheshem mishpat shilas about a person who borrowed someone else's chainmail and didn't return it, or it got ruined, or it's very interesting where you could track the fact that they clearly owned weapons. There's Ravia, for example, a whole complicated story with a woman who brought in a chasam to her marriage, and part of what she brought into the marriage, it's the one threatening woman, was a full suit of armor and a shield. This is what she came into the marriage. This was her party. This is what her parents sent her with. It's just a warning to the husband. And she lent it to some other guy, and they didn't return it. It got damaged, a whole shayla in the Raviyah, for example. The famous din that the Rami Rottenberg says that you're not supposed to go to shul carrying your big sword. It's brought down b'shem the Talmidim. The Rami Rottenberg moicha leilach psakin aruch lebeis haknesses. He was moicha on people coming to shul with a long sword, which means there were Jews walking around with a long sword. Right? Anytime you see something like that, it means there were Jews with long swords. So there was definitely Jews who were armed. This earliest form of like a musket, a gun, it's called a blistira, like a gun. Some of the places can handle a blistira. There's a shaila from the Mari Bruna and the Mari Weil discussing lending a gun, the gun getting damaged, etc. So you see some little here and there spotty appearances of Jews having weapons. But by and large, Jews were mostly peaceful people, like we always are, and they were not heavily armed, and they certainly weren't part of the army. Now, after draft became a thing in Europe, so Jews who lived in all these countries started getting drafted slowly. It was like a trickle. They started getting drafted to the army. Now, we spoke other times about what type of flood it ended up being, meaning that there was 1 million soldiers in World War II who were Jewish, but that was under different conditions and whatever. But early on, in the late, probably the late 1600s into the 1700s, late 1700s, probably when the first real batches of Jewish soldiers started getting drafted, and you find Rabbanim having to confront, how to guide soldiers who are out in the field, soldiers who are in the army. Meaning it was a brand new shaila that Rabbanim had to deal with. How do you guide soldiers who are out in the field, who are out in battle, or doing something? They're under very compromising circumstances. What's mutter for them is not mutter for everybody else. There's all sorts of things that have to happen. It's a very compromising situation. And you find the Rabbanim starting to deal with it. Now, this interesting thing I came across, the Noda B'Yehuda, who was the Rav of Prague. The Noda B'Yehuda was a Gadol Hadar, a Pesach Hadar, but he was also a Rav of a city that had people, and here's a story that's told over in the biography of the Noda B'Yehuda. Yom Gimel, Tes Zayin Ha'avar, Tes Zayin of the last month, Nilkechu Chafei Anashim Mikilaseinu La'avedis HaTzava, Ala Agala B'Pkudas HaKeser, Yoram Hoydai. They took 25 young men to the army, off to the army. Atihi Sharuri Gedola B'Recheves Seir. It was a big tumult. Shamanu Kol Imais Mevakes Abaneim. We heard mothers crying for their children. Achiyes Alacheim, sisters crying about their brothers. Na'aras Abal Nureim, young wives who were losing their young husbands. Ba'azva Masir Meladitam Latzis Bekrav Neged Seinenu, who were being forced out to battle against our enemies. V'achrei Hisafsam Yachad Bekasrani. After they were gathered together in the square where they were taken away, Rabbi Cheskel the Noda B'Yehuda went to talk to them, Tachnunim, to tell them Hartze Geverter, to explain to them what halachas they need to know now that they're going to be in the army. Humam Levav Shemam, Terdene Ineim Pal Gemaim. It was a very heartfelt event. They were crying. Gam Hema Gamanche Muhammad, the people standing around, and the people who were drafted. Amdu Svivam Vayevtichu Lekahala Vedasam Lashamram. They promise that they're going to protect everyone. So this is they're painting a poignant, sad picture of the Noda B'Yehuda, the Rav of Prague. I don't even know this is in Prague. It might have been in his earlier shul in Yampoli, maybe, going out to a crowded square with all sorts of, distraught women around the periphery crying about losing their sons or their brothers or their husbands to the army, and I'm sure a bunch of stoic young men standing in the center who are going to do what they have to do, no crying there. And the Noda B'Yehuda goes and he's going to talk to them. Now, I will not embarrass myself and try to read 2 pages of the most archaic Yiddish I've ever come across, but it's in Yiddish, and it starts off meine Brüder, and when Noda B'Yehuda talks to them, and the little bit that I could glean from this, he tells them that you're going out into the field, you're going to a place where it's not pasha to be Jewish, but gedenk kindlech that a Yid is a Yid no matter where he goes. Even if you're out in the field and you're out in very compromising circumstances, he's still a Yid. And then he says as follows, I'll break my teeth a little bit. He says, Shemtaich der Yiddische, don't be embarrassed about being a Jew, he tells them. And then he gave them each a care package. Nasan l'kolachad kufsa hamachila tzitzis, siddur v'tfilin. He gave each person a care packet that had tzitzis, tfilin, and a siddur. And he says, when you put these on and when you daven, remember that wherever you are, he said, make sure to say Shema Yisrael every day. Shabbos, he says, Ken Halton, you could keep Shabbos. Well, instructions on what to do, meaning it's a very beautiful, if I could read the Yiddish, it would be much more beautiful, set of instructions from a very, very caring and emotional Rav who's saying goodbye to 25 of the young men from the town and telling them how to live in the army. Now, this thing that the Noda B'Yehuda is, this discussion that the Noda B'Yehuda is having, this, tear-filled discussion that he's having with these soldiers, is unfortunately a conversation that was repeated many hundreds or possibly thousands of times over the next, decades and centuries, as from every town, groups of Jewish boys were drafted into the army, to the point where, this is the most famous one, Chafetz Chaim put out a sefer called Machne Yisrael. think the first time the Sefer was published was in the year like 1887 or something. It's a long time ago. Chafetz Chaim put it out. This is way before the Mishnah Berurah. This is way before everything. Chafetz Chaim put out a Sefer, so to speak, guidance for Jewish boys who are in the army. And he says as follows. He starts with a whole different angle. He says, Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael shebarov tu v'naslon asklichem dasei. He says he starts with Klal Yisrael's provenance. Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. He brought us to Eretz Yisrael. He gave us a Beis Hamikdash. He gave us Nevi'im. We were guided. We were close. We were very close to Hashem, he says. Then he gave us a Torah that tells us how to live, everything that we need. He says, but over time, we became distant. And we went into Galus, and our Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. And Yom Shechar Beis Hamikdash Chemish Barzel Mafsekes Ben Yisrael Aviyim Shabashamayim. From the time the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we just passed the Sar B'Tevis. It's the Haskalah of Galus. Klal Yisrael has an iron curtain between them and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not Hashem's fault. It's not Hashem, it's us. We're not doing enough to be redeemed. Rabbi says, you're going to have to work for people and things. It says, and he says, in that parsha that talks about being forced out to Galus, being forced out to distant lands to work for other people, which he's using as a mashal for the draft, he says, when you'll seek him out, he'll be found to us over there. As long as it's sincere. If you sincerely seek out Hashem wherever you are, you're going to find him. So this is the Chafetz Chaim writing to these soldiers. You're going out into the field. You're going out to a place where you're going to feel super distant. It's Galus and Galus. It's like it's the deepest you could be in Galus. You're far away. You're out in an army somewhere, in some Siberian village, who knows where, with no Jews anywhere in sight. He says you have to stay close. That's the Eitzah. Now he says, but what's the biggest problem, he says, with being able to maintain this kesher with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even when you're so far afield? He says the biggest problem is pashat lack of knowledge. People don't know what the halach is. There's so many cases that could arise, so many shalos that could arise. People just don't know the answer, he says. And yes, granted, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, the Baal Shulchan Aruch, wrote a whole sefer with all the dinim, and any Rav Musmuch knows all the Shulchan Aruch, but you're far out somewhere, you don't have anybody to ask, you don't have anybody to talk to, there's no way to make sense of it, he says. So I'm going to write for you a Kitzer sefer that's going to encompass all the basic halachas that a person could need in the next 30-something prakim or 40-something prakim over here. Chafetz Chaim goes through Dalet Chalkei Shulchan Aruch that are negayah to a soldier who's out of field and tells them what the Shura Tachtana is, like what the bottom line is, where you could cut a corner, where you can't cut a corner, what's important, what's less important. Because Chafetz Chaim wanted to desperately care for these, Yiddish kinder who were far away, who were in the army. He wanted to help them out. Now, Stam, interesting side note, when this sefer was republished in Eretz Yisrael in the 70s or the 60s, it got a hakdama from Mendel Zaks, Chafetz Chaim's son-in-law, and he wrote there something very interesting. I don't know if everybody knows this, I'll just read it because it's cute. He says, I'm going to reissue the sefer that the Chafetz Chaim wrote. The Chafetz Chaim put it out in 1881. She asked him, tell them what to do. He says, I don't need to tell you how good Chafetz Chaim is. I'm saying by the time this is in the 1960s, everybody knows how good the Chafetz Chaim is. They're all in the Skabel, in the Svarsim, ganz Klal Yisrael learns them, whether it's lahalacha l'maisa, hein b'musar v'chizik b'teres Hashem, v'hein la'am Hashem, v'apoisik achron asher olav nisham beis Yisrael. The Chafetz Chaim has already risen to the stature of the poisik achron. He's the final decider on everything, halacha, hashkafa, etc. He says, Yudua u'meforsemes hashpa ha'gedola v'tayelas harbe asher hevi sefer zeh b'chai anshe atzav b'medinas rotzi yopelim l'fnem. It's well known what an impact this sefer had, how many people this was able to save in Russia and Poland back in the day. Now here's the punchline. It says, Tikvasi me Hashem, Shiyeh kemoikin l'tayelas gedola. There should be a big tayelas la'achenu asher b'tzava be'eretz Yisrael. There should be a big tayelas for all the people who were in the IDF in Sahel. B'chol makim shehem. So Mendel Zaks is reissuing the sefer with like the intention that people in the Israeli army should be able to read it and learn the halacha. Now, depending on what side of the coin you're on, this is either a big insult or a big compliment. Because either it means that Mendel Zaks sees the Israeli army as exactly the same as the Cantonist army, as the Tsar's army, and you're as mufka from a Shulchan Aruch and a halacha and a Torah there as you are anywhere else, and you need the Machne Yisrael, so then it's a big insult. Or it's a compliment that, there's an army now, and it's Israel. Whatever side of the coin you're on, you'll read this how you want. But it's just a cute, ironic detail in the way the Mendel Zaks reissues this country for Klal Yisrael again. Now,
is it still in print?
Yeah, sure. Today they publish Kol Kisvei Chavetz Chaim in 5 or 6 volumes. It has all the Svarim the Chavetz Chaim wrote. So this is one of the Svarim. It actually there's a few interesting things there, because the Chavetz Chaim writes sometimes coolest there that he doesn't write in his other Svarim, because, it tells you sometimes like where the guardrail is. Like the Chavetz Chaim in the Mishabura, I wouldn't say he's a machmer, but he's not a mekel. He's more noited to be machmer. The Chavetz Chaim wants to be shavel chol nefesh, but in the Machan Yisrael you'll find coolest that you won't find in the Mishabura. So it has like a certain place, a certain value. In any case, this is the hakdama, the way these rabbanim gedolim poskim were dealing with soldiers in the army. Now, I want to start dealing with some of the shilas that could arise, particularly gun-related questions. There's so many questions that can be talked about. The Israeli rabbis like Rabbi Goren, let's say, put out a sefer Meshav Milchama, 3 volumes, 3 fat volumes, and like there's endless shilas that can be discussed in military-related. So we're going to try to narrow it down to some gun-related shilas for now, and we'll work our way from there. Now, there's a tshuva from the Kleisenberger Rebbe. You would not expect to be in this, line of fire, for lack of a better word. The Kleisenberger Rebbe has a shayla about carrying a gun on Shabbos. He's talking to soldiers who are not at wartime. It's not pikuach nefesh. They're on the base, but the rule is that on the base even, you're supposed to walk around carrying your weapons. They want everyone to be armed. And he has a whole langa tshuva in Divrei Yatziv and Orach Chaim Chelik Aleph, and we'll read some of the tshuva. But at the end...
Would it make a difference even someone not in the army?
We'll talk about that also. So yes, and at the end of the tshuva, there's an Erev question, a muksa question. Oh yeah. We're not... Disclaimer. We're not here to pass on halacha l'maisa. We're here to just discuss it. It's part of the context of what we're talking about. We're not halacha l'maisa. Yeah, if you see someone who's sitting 2 seats down from me in shul with a gun, he should talk to his rabbi, and it's not, 2 seats in any direction it could be. There's no way to know. But the Kleisenberger, in the end of this tshuva, he writes something very touching. I got like a touching little thing. He writes as follows. He says, Nehanesi mimichtavecha. It's like a compliment. He says, I really enjoyed your letter. V'nasati simcha b'livi. It was made me happy. Shari'isi she'Yisrael kedoshim heim. I saw that Klal Yisrael's heilig. He's writing to someone who's writing from the Israeli army. U'medaktikim v'mitzvahs b'kala keb'chamura. And the medaktikim mitzvahs kala b'chamura b'chol makom she'hem. In whatever place they find themselves. V'shamati, he says, and this is an interesting thing he brings. V'shamati b'shem hareba HaKadosh. Me'reinu harav Menachem Mendel Miriminov Zatzal. I heard b'shem the Riminover. Shebeschos anshe hatzava haYehudim, in the schos, in the merit of Jewish soldiers. The cause for the Geula is going to be Jewish soldiers. What the Rimon of meant is whatever area they found themselves, how distant they are, the Jewish soldiers are the most far-flung, tzezets the people, and they're still medaktik in every halacha as best they can. Those are the people who are going to be the schos that brings Mashiach. Schos has a yamid lahachish kulasenu p'tus nafshena idei ben David kaftachas harabah kadosh mirimin of zatzal. The amein kein yiratzen v'hiruim liikasev bes. Fine, this is what it says. So the Klezmer writes this. Now I've got a scene in like some more Zionist Svarim writing that you see the Rimonov already predicted and said that the soldiers in the army are going to be the cause for the Geula. Meaning, like, and they use that to say soldiers in the army, like an IDF soldier is going to be it's their schos that's going to cause the Geula. Lamaisa. Be that as it may, whether it is or it isn't, it's certainly out of context from what the Rimonov was saying. Because the Rimonov is talking about, you see it clearly from the context, the Rimonov is talking like the Noid Behuda, he's talking like the Chavetz Chaim, like people far-flung who don't have access to anything, who are all alone, a kid from a shtetl is all alone somewhere in an army, doesn't know where to put himself and what to do, and he still clings to whatever little, Yiddishkeit that he could. That's the Mesiras Nefesh that's going to bring the Geula. Now, what's interesting is that Tsar Nikolai, who was famous for his Cantonist decree, desperately wanted to convert Jewish boys. Part of the mission of putting Jewish boys in the Russian army was to convert them to Catholicism, not Catholicism, to the Russian Orthodox Church. He wanted them to be Christians. The percentage of Jewish boys who were Cantonists who converted in any single year was never higher than 2%, which is wild if you think about it. You're taking boys, ripping them away from their parents at 11, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, putting them in some Russian army school for half a decade, then sending them out into an army barrack somewhere for 25 years, and that they still had the gvura, the identity, the Jewish identity, to not convert, even though they knew very little. They were mostly fry. They were eating treif, and they were not keeping Shabbos. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible for them. That they still maintained some sort of Yiddish identity is an amazing Kiddush Hashem, and that's what the Rimonov is referring to. That these people are the people who schosim, will bring Mashiach. Now, these Cantonists, Lamashal, after they left the army, a lot of them, they had their own shuls. They barely could read. They had their own batei kfaris. They had their own, they maintained some sort of frum identity, no matter how far they were pushed away. Now, here I want to start talking about the gun issue for a second. There, 1 second. So these. And there's actually another issue that I want to talk about first. We're talking now about these soldiers who are mamish in the army and they're pushed away. They're not shaykh any frumkai. There's actually an interesting set of chaylas in the poskim that come up as follows. There, oftentimes there's an aguna shayla with people who are in the army. Right? You have people who are missing in action, and they were married, and you don't know the wife's mutter, not mutter. Now, a lot of times, the one who's going to come say Edus is a member of their platoon. Like a soldier who was in the foxhole with them, in the trenches with them, will come and say Edus. Now, the problem is that all these soldiers who are in the army are, by and large, fry. They don't keep the Torah, they don't keep Shabbos, they don't keep Kashrus. These are not from soldiers. Could you trust the Edus of these soldiers who are coming to be made in Aguna Shailas? Now, here, you find another, glut of Shailas from the Paiskim that handle this. Lamashal, the Divrei Chaim. This Shlomo, I went to a tshuva from Shlomo Kluger that I'm trying to find. 1 second. I don't know. This is the tshuva from the Divrei Chaim, this tshuva from Shlomo Kluger, this tshuva from the Shayla Meshiv. That most of them, I should say. I'll read it from Shlomo Kluger. He says. I can't find the exact quote, but a lot of these poskim, each one, in their own language, says that as much as these people are fry, so to speak, and they're out there and they're not eating kosher, they're not keeping Shabbos, at the end of the day, we look at them as from, more or less, meaning they're still neman for Edus. Why? Because this is the most you could expect of them, which is a pretty revolutionary idea. Meaning the poskim, I'm paraphrasing, and someone could argue with me and say I'm overdoing it. This is all true, but. The many of these places, when the Shaila happens a dozen times, I have it over here in a whole kuntras, like the Shailas happened a dozen times, the Shailas, and most of the places, when there are places where Machman say that they're fried, they can't be Neman, it doesn't matter, but a nice amount of the places who handle the Shailas say, these are people who don't know anything at all, they cling with whatever ability they have to the little remaining Yiddishkeit that they have, and whatever it is for them, when they say Shema Yisrael, if that's all they remember, that's as us davening 3 times a day and eating kosher and keeping Shabbos. No. The nemanis they lose their nemanis because they're not religious. They're not, it's mummer. They're not mumrim. These are not mumrim. These are people who are in terribly, terrible, devastating circumstances where all they have left is this tiny...
They care. They're doing...
Yeah, they care. Exactly. They have this tiny sliver of yadus that's open to them, and they care about it immensely. I should have... If I would have prepared better, I would have the exact quotes. But there's in a lot of the poskim, they're quoting this idea that these are considered, still from a Yidden in a certain sense. They're not considered like fry Yidden because they're doing their best. Now, one of the main shilas that always is presented with these soldiers in the army is Chil Shabbos. This is one of the main questions of the Nidin. And there's a few chuvas from the Melamed Lahayil and etc. about soldiers not going to the army because of Chil Shabbos. What should they do if they have to be Chil Shabbos, etc. For example, if it's all, that's not so big to us. It's Chil Shabbos. Now, Bisman Hazeh, still, that's probably the most common shaila of that comes up in the army, is Chil Shabbos. That's because today, most armies have kosher food available, whether it's Israel or America or etc. Kosher food's available, but Shabbos is not a break in the action, right? So let's go through the tzadim. If you're in a matzav pikuach nefesh, you're in the middle of a battle, so that we've spoken about weeks ago already, there's a Mefurish Gemara in Sanhedrin, Adridita, right, that you're allowed to do battle during Shabbos. Frat, pikuach nefesh, derech nefashis, you're on the field somewhere, that's not the shayla. The shayla more is regular patrols, or carrying a weapon around when there's no Erev, or if it's muktzah, or etc. Carrying the weapons around, these are the Chil Shabbos shaylas that arise. Now these are many, many different shaylas, but I think it's a bad moment. I'm not going to have enough time to wrap up the gun shaylas. I also don't want to start it. So I think I'm going to hold it here. We'll call this an introduction, and we'll do next week. We'll just do straight gun questions. Gun in shul, gun leisilbash, gun on Shabbos. We'll just do straight guns. We'll call this Akdama and we'll pick up.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.